The day Ella Atwood accepted half of what she was owed, she told herself it was the practical thing to do, and she believed that lie for 3 long years until a sun-darkened stranger with quiet eyes and a slow way of speaking made her understand that practicality had been slowly killing her. It was the spring of 1878 in Caldwell, Kansas, a cattle town that smelled of dust and ambition, and the particular kind of desperation that settles over a place when too many people arrive with too many dreams and not enough water. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, and with it came the drovers pushing longhorn cattle up the Kisham Trail, the merchants chasing their dollars, the gamblers chasing everyone else's, and somewhere in the middle of all that noise and commerce, Ella Atwood was trying to survive. She ran a laundry operation out of the back of a narrow building on 2nd Street, the kind of establishment that nobody noticed until they needed clean clothes and nobody appreciated until it was gone. She had started it with money borrowed from her late father's savings, a man who had come to Kansas from Ohio believing the soil would treat him better than it had treated his own father, and who had died of a chest infection in the winter of 1875, before he had managed to prove himself right or wrong. He had left Ella the money, the parcel of land the laundry sat on, and a habit of undercharging for her work that she had inherited without realizing it was a flaw and not a virtue. Her arrangement with the Caldwell Merchants Association was the source of the present trouble. She washed linens for 3 of the town's boarding houses and laundered the work shirts and trousers of a rotating cast of trail hands, and she had entered into a written agreement with Harold Midge, who served as secretary of the association, and who had the round, earnest face of a man who had learned early in life that looking trustworthy was more profitable than being trustworthy. The agreement stipulated that Ella would receive $4 per week from each boarding house for regular service, plus 2 cents per item for individual garments from private customers. For 6 months she had kept meticulous records in a small cloth-bound ledger that she maintained with the same careful attention her father had given to his field rows. And for 6 months, Harold Midge had been underpaying her by amounts small enough to seem like honest mistakes and large enough, when totaled, to represent nearly $11 that belonged to her and not to him. On the morning this story truly begins, Ella walked into the association's office on Main Street with her ledger tucked under her arm and her chin lifted at the precise angle she had learned conveyed seriousness without aggression, because aggression in a woman in 1878 Kansas was treated as evidence of instability rather than justified grievance. Harold Midge looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit and had already decided how it would end. "Miss Atwood," he said pleasantly, "what a fine morning to come calling." "It is a fine morning," Ella agreed, sitting down in the chair across from him without being invited to, which she knew made him uncomfortable, and which she considered a small, necessary act of self-preservation. "I have come about the discrepancy in my payments." She opened the ledger and placed it on the desk facing him, her finger tracing down the column of figures she had recorded with such care. He leaned forward and looked at it with the expression of a man examining something mildly puzzling rather than damning. $11.40, she said. "Over the past 6 months, I have the dates and amounts here. I understand bookkeeping is complicated work, but I believe these numbers are quite clear." Harold Midge sat back in his chair and folded his hands. "Miss Atwood, I appreciate your diligence. You have always been diligent. But I think if we account for the weeks where service was, shall we say, incomplete—" "Service was never incomplete," Ella said, and she kept her voice level because she had practiced keeping it level. "Every item in my records was delivered on time and clean. I have never once failed to fulfill my end of the agreement." He studied her for a moment and she watched him run through calculations that had nothing to do with laundry and everything to do with what he thought he could get away with. "I can offer you $6, he said finally, with the tone of a man making a generous concession, "as a gesture of goodwill, to resolve any confusion." Ella sat very still, $6. She had been owed $11.40, and he was offering her 6. And the word he used for the difference between those two numbers was confusion, as if the missing $5.40 existed in some uncertain space between them rather than in his pocket. "I've never once asked for more than I'm owed," she said quietly. "I am asking now only for what is mine, $11.40. Harold Midge smiled at her with something she could only call practiced patience. $6 is a fair resolution," he said. "I'd encourage you to consider it carefully, Miss Atwood. The association represents significant business for a laundry operation of your size. Significant business that could, of course, be directed elsewhere should our arrangement become less than mutually satisfactory." The threat was dressed in such pleasant clothing that for a moment it almost looked like advice. Ella picked up her ledger. She thought about her father's land and the small building on 2nd Street and the debt she still owed on the copper tubs she had purchased last year. She thought about practicality. She said, "I will consider your offer," and she walked out, and she did not let her hands shake until she was half a block away. She did not see the man who had been standing outside the association's office when she emerged, leaning against the post with his arms crossed and his hat brim low, but he saw her. He had heard voices through the thin plank wall, not words exactly but the shape of the conversation, and he had seen the particular way she held herself when she came out straight-backed and deliberate and furious, in a way she was not permitting herself to show. Vernon Ramsey had been in Caldwell for 4 days. He was 31 years old, originally from a small settlement outside of Abilene, and he had spent the last several years working as a cattle inspector for the Kansas Livestock Association, which required him to travel between various cattle towns, verifying the health and legitimacy of herds before they were sold at market. He was not a lawman, but he carried some of the same authority that came from a badge and a territorial appointment, and he had a reputation in the trade for being unfailingly honest, which in a business full of shortcuts and creative accounting made him both respected and occasionally inconvenient. He was in Caldwell because there were reports of a rancher selling cattle under 2 different brand registrations to collect double payments from unwitting buyers, and the investigation had brought him to the association's office that morning to review their records. He had arrived a few minutes early and had been waiting, listening without meaning to, and what he had heard had bothered him in the specific way that certain kinds of unfairness had always bothered him, the kind that was dressed up in politeness and paperwork, and the quiet assumption that the person being wronged would accept it because they had no real choice. He watched Ella Atwood walk down the street with her ledger under her arm, and the morning light doing something complicated to the color of her hair, which was dark brown with threads of copper that the Kansas sun had drawn out, and he thought she was one of the most self-contained people he had ever observed, which was the first thought he had about her before any other kind of thought had a chance to form. He did not follow her. He went into the association's office, conducted his business with Harold Midge, who was visibly relieved to be moving on to a different subject, and he spent the rest of the morning reviewing shipping manifests. He saw her again that afternoon at the general store. She was purchasing washing soda, and she was haggling over the price with the same quiet precision she had brought to Harold Midge's office, and the proprietor, a man named Foster, was giving her the same kind of measured resistance that seemed to be the town's default response to her, as if everyone had silently agreed that Ella Atwood was a woman who could be pushed a little further than she thought she could. She ended up paying more than the washing soda was worth. Vernon could see it in the way her jaw set very slightly when she counted out the coins, and he could see that she knew it too. He said without planning to, "He charged the Harmon Ranch hand 2 cents less per pound last Tuesday." Ella turned. She looked at him with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who had learned not to be surprised by strangers talking to her but who reserved the right to determine quickly whether the talking was worth her time. "Excuse me," she said. "The washing soda. I was here Tuesday. He charged 2 cents less per pound to a man buying 3 times what you just bought. She looked at him steadily. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered by outdoor work into something that was honest rather than handsome, though if pressed he was that too, in the way that useful things sometimes were. His eyes were the color of the Kansas sky in October, a dark clear blue that suggested depth without drama. "And you remember the price per pound of washing soda from 4 days ago," she said, not quite a question. "I remember numbers," he said simply. "It's part of my work." "What work is that?" "Cattle inspection. I'm Vernon Ramsey with the Kansas Livestock Association." She considered him for another moment. "Ella Atwood," she said. "I run the laundry on 2nd Street. "I know," he said, and then realized that sounded odd. "I heard your name this morning at the association office." Something moved behind her eyes, quick and carefully controlled. "Ah," she said. "I wasn't eavesdropping on purpose," he said. "Most people who eavesdrop say that," she replied, but there was no real sharpness in it. She tucked her package of washing soda under her arm. "Thank you for the information about the price. I will know better for next time." She started to walk away and then stopped and turned back, which surprised him. "How much of the conversation did you hear?" she asked. He didn't pretend not to understand which conversation she meant. "Enough," he said. She nodded once, as if he had confirmed something she had suspected, and then she walked out of the store, and Vernon Ramsey stood in the general store in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, and felt the peculiar sensation of a person who has just witnessed something that they cannot immediately leave alone. He stayed in Caldwell longer than his investigation strictly required. He told himself this was because the double branding case had threads that needed following, which was partially true. But on the second evening after meeting Ella in the store, he walked past the laundry on 2nd Street at the end of the day when he knew she would be finishing her work, because he had passed it at the same time the day before and had seen the lamp light going out around 6, and he stopped by the hitching post out front as if he were resting his legs. She came out carrying a basket of finished linens, stopped when she saw him, and set the basket down. "Mr. Ramsey," she said. "Miss Atwood," he said. "I was passing." She looked at him with the same level assessment she had given him in the store. "You were passing 2nd Street at 6 in the evening with no particular destination." "I was thinking about supper," he said. "Do you know a good place?" It was so transparent that a slight warmth came into her expression, not quite a smile but the preparation for one. "Me's dining room on the main street," she said. "She does a beef stew that doesn't insult you." "Would you join me?" he said. And then, because he was a direct person who disliked the circling that people did when they were afraid of a clear answer, he added, "I'd like to talk to you. You are interesting, and I don't mean that as a compliment people say without thinking. I mean it specifically." Ella Atwood looked at him for a long moment. She was 26 years old, and she had been running her own business for 3 years, and she had not, in that time, allowed herself much in the way of distraction, which was what she called anything that was not the laundry or the land payments or the ledger. She thought of Harold Midge and his $6 offer, and the word goodwill as a container for theft, and she thought she could probably use one meal that had nothing to do with any of that. "All right," she said. "Let me put this basket inside." Me's dining room was small and warm and smelled of wood smoke and cooked onions, which Vernon found comforting in the way that honest smells always were comforting. They sat at a table near the window, and Me herself, a broad-shouldered woman in her 50s with the no-nonsense manner of someone who had seen every variety of human behavior and had decided to feed people regardless, brought them stew and bread without being asked. "You come here often," Vernon observed, watching Me set the bowl in front of Ella with the familiarity of a long-standing arrangement. "Every Tuesday and Thursday, when I don't feel like cooking for myself," Ella said. "Me gives me a fair price. Does anyone else in this town give you a fair price?" She looked up from her stew. "That's a direct question." "I told you I'm a direct person," he said. She considered the question seriously, which he appreciated because she did not seem to be someone who gave careless answers. "Some do," she said. "The smith charges me what he charges everyone. The postmaster is honest. A few others. She paused. But there are certain people in this town who have decided that a woman running a business without a husband or a father to stand beside her is a woman who can be, as Harold Midge would say, negotiated with. Negotiated with meaning given less than she's owed, Vernon said. Yes, she said, meaning that. He was quiet for a moment, eating his stew, which was as good as she had promised. What are you going to do about Midge? I'm going to take the $6, she said, and she said it with the flat certainty of someone who has already made peace with a decision they do not like. Because the boarding house contracts represent 40% of my income, and if he directs them elsewhere, I'll lose the laundry inside of 3 months. The land too, eventually. But the $11 is yours. Yes, she said. It is mine. But wanting what is yours and being able to afford to insist on it are two different things. Vernon set down his spoon. He had heard a version of this reasoning many times in his work, from small ranchers who let themselves be underpaid for their cattle because the buyer had the leverage and they had the debt, and it had always struck him as one of the quieter cruelties of commerce, the way that the people with the least margin were the ones most reliably cheated. "How long have you been running the laundry?" he asked. 3 years, she said, "since my father died, and before that, I helped him on the land. Before that I taught myself to read proper accounts from a book he bought in Ohio." She said this without sentimentality, just as information. He believed in being practical. "It sounds like you took that seriously." "I took everything he taught me seriously," she said, and then something shifted very slightly in her expression, the smallest loosening around her eyes. "He also believed in being fair. He always said that a person who charges honestly and works honestly builds something that lasts. I have tried to do that. And yet the people around you are not doing the same by you," Vernon said. "No," she said. "They are not." She looked at him directly. "Why does this concern you, Mr. Ramsey? You are a cattle inspector with a case to work. I am a laundress with a ledger dispute. These things are not connected." He held her gaze. "They are connected by the fact that I can see what is happening and I think it is wrong," he said simply. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable and then looked back at her stew. "That is a generous position," she said, "but concern doesn't recover $11. What does the contract say exactly?" he asked. "The written one with the association." She looked up. "I have the original at the laundry." "Why?" "Because I review contracts as part of my work," he said. "Written agreements, payment schedules, delivery terms. I have become reasonably good at reading what they actually mean as opposed to what someone tells you they mean." She studied him. "Are you offering to look at my contract?" "I'm asking if you would allow me to," he said. "There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment. Around them the dining room murmured with the end-of-day conversations of Caldwell drovers talking about the market, a merchant complaining about freight rates, me moving between tables with the efficient grace of someone who had spent decades doing exactly this. Outside, the light was going golden and amber over the street, the particular light of Kansas in the late afternoon that made even a cattle town look beautiful for an hour or so before darkness. "All right," Ella said finally. "You can look at it. But I won't have it said that I brought a man into my business to make my decisions for me. If you see something I've missed, you tell me what it is, and I decide what to do with that information." "That's exactly how it should work," Vernon said, and he meant it. They went to the laundry after supper. Ella lit the lamp and retrieved the contract from the tin box where she kept her important papers, and she spread it on the table she used for sorting garments, which was the largest flat surface in the building. Vernon stood beside her and read it carefully twice, in the way he had taught himself to read documents, first for the plain meaning, and then for the edges where the language softened or grew vague. He found it on the second reading. It was in the second paragraph of the third section, a clause that addressed payment timing, buried in a sentence that was written with the particular kind of complexity that suggested it had been made complex on purpose. "Here," he said, pointing. "This clause says payment is due within 14 days of the end of each billing cycle, which is the last day of the month." But look at this language. It says payment is subject to adjustment for any service shortfall as determined by the association's secretary. That's the clause Midge has been using to justify the deductions, Ella said. He claims there were service shortfalls on weeks I missed. Did you ever miss a week? No. Did you ever receive any written notice of a claimed service shortfall at the time it supposedly occurred? She stopped. She looked at the contract and then at him. No, she said slowly. He never said anything until I brought the ledger to him. He never wrote to me at the time. The clause says adjustments must be communicated in writing within 7 days of the service period in question, Vernon said, reading carefully. If no written notice was given at the time, the adjustment is not valid under the terms of the contract. Your $11.40 is contractually protected. Ella read the clause herself, her finger moving along the line of text. He watched her face as she understood it, watched the careful neutrality she kept as her default expression give way to something that was close to anger but also something close to relief, the particular feeling of being told that you were right about something you had known was right but had been made to doubt. He did not give written notice, she said. He has never given me written notice of anything. Our communication has always been verbal. Then he is in breach of his own contract, Vernon said. Not you, she straightened. She set the contract back on the table and she looked at Vernon Ramsey in the lamplight of her small laundry building, and she said, with a quiet steadiness that he thought was one of the more impressive things he had heard in some time, "Then I am going back to that office tomorrow and I am asking for $11.40. Good, he said. You would come with me, she asked. Not pleading, not requesting, asking carefully as a person who does not make a habit of asking asks. If you want me there, he said. I want your knowledge of the contract language, she said precisely, in case he disputes the reading. I understand, he said. And he did understand, and he respected it, the precision with which she drew the line between needing company and needing expertise. He thought most people would not make that distinction, would simply be grateful for help and call it anything convenient. But Ella Atwood named things with the accuracy of someone who had learned that naming things wrong led to misunderstandings that cost you money. She walked him to the door and he put on his hat, and the night air of Caldwell came in, warm and smelling of the stockyards and the distant plains. And he said good night, and she said good night, and he walked back toward his boarding house on Main Street, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, which was the specific anticipation of wanting to see a person again. The next morning they walked into Harold Midge's office together, and Ella set her ledger on the desk and the contract beside it, and pointed to the clause and said, calmly and without theater, that she would be accepting payment of $11.40 in full, because any adjustment to that amount was invalid under the terms of Section 3, Paragraph 2 of their written agreement, as no written notification of service shortfalls had ever been provided within the required 7-day window. Harold Midge looked at the contract. He looked at Vernon, who was standing slightly behind and to the side of Ella, not speaking, not needing to speak, simply present in the way that a solid fact is present. Midge's round, earnest face went through several phases of calculation very quickly. I'll need to have our attorney review this interpretation, he said. You're welcome to do that, Ella said. I'll expect payment within 14 days as the contract specifies. After that, I'll be speaking to the town magistrate about the breach. She picked up both documents and walked out, and Vernon followed her, and they stood on the boardwalk in the morning sun, and he looked at her and she looked at him, and she said, I did not shake that time. He smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile fully, and it changed his face in a way she found herself cataloging without meaning to. You didn't need to shake, he said. You were entirely right. Being right has not always been sufficient in that office, she said. No, he said. But this time you had the words to prove it. She was quiet for a moment, standing in the sunlight. Thank you, she said, for the clause for coming. You did the work, he said. We did the work, she said, correcting him, and he accepted the correction. He had not planned to stay in Caldwell past the end of the week. His double branding investigation had progressed to the point where he needed to travel to Wichita to consult the Central Livestock Registry records, and there was no professional reason to delay. But he found reasons to delay, small ones. A second interview he claimed was necessary, a report that required more detail, and he recognized these reasons for what they were, which was excuses that a 31-year-old man was making because he had met a 26-year-old woman who made him think in ways he had not thought in some years. He had been married once before. Her name had been Caroline, and she had died of typhoid in the summer of 1873, 2 years into their marriage, in the small house they had kept outside of Abilene, and he had grieved her thoroughly and honestly, and had then spent the years since working without much attention to anything else. He had not been unhappy exactly, but he had been narrow, focused in the way that grief sometimes focuses a person into a lane so thin that very little else fits alongside it. Ella Atwood did not fit in a narrow lane. She was too much herself for that. He began visiting the laundry in the late afternoons when her heavy work was done. He had no pretext for it after the first visit, and so he dropped the pretense of pretext, which she seemed to prefer. She would be sorting or pressing or working through her account books when he arrived, and she made him coffee on the small stove she kept in the back corner, and they talked. They talked about his work, which she found genuinely interesting, and asked specific questions about the mechanics of brand registration, the way inspection certificates worked, the economics of the cattle drives. They talked about her work, which he found equally interesting in the way that systems with precise requirements always interested him, the chemistry of the washing, the logistics of the delivery routes, the way she had organized her pricing structure. They talked about Caldwell, about Kansas, about the railroad and what it was doing to the cattle trade, about the Kishom Trail and whether it would outlast the decade. They were very careful around the personal things, both of them, in the way of two people who have learned that offering personal things carelessly leads to loss. He told her about Caroline on the third week of his extended stay, sitting at the sorting table with his coffee going cool because they had been talking for an hour. He did not make a ceremony of it. He said that he had been married and his wife had died, and it had been 5 years, and he thought she should know that because they were spending a good deal of time together, and he preferred that she have accurate information about who he was. Ella listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "I'm sorry. Typhoid is a terrible illness." "It is," he said. "Were you happy?" she asked, which surprised him because most people asked other things. Saw his surprise and explained, "I ask because I think it matters, whether the loss was also the loss of happiness or only the loss of a person." He thought about it. "Both," he said. "She was a good person and we were happy. The loss was—" He paused. "It was very complete." Ella nodded. She wrapped her hands around her own cup. "My father's death was complete in that way," she said. "He was the person who made sense of things for me. After he was gone, I had to learn how to make sense of things myself. It takes longer that way." "But you did it," he said. "I am doing it," she said, with the precision he had come to expect from her. Harold Midge paid the $11.40 at the end of the second week, delivered by a boy with a folded envelope, no note inside. Ella told Vernon that evening, and he said, "Good," and she said, "Yes." And there was a pause in which both of them sat with the fact that the practical reason for his extended presence in Caldwell had been resolved, and neither of them mentioned it directly. "I have to go to Wichita," he said after the pause. "The investigation. I've delayed it longer than I should have." "I know," she said. She was pressing a shirt at the ironing board and she did not look up. "When do you leave?" "Day after tomorrow," he said. He watched her work. The motion of her pressing was steady and even. "I'll be there 2 weeks, possibly 3. "That's a reasonable time for an investigation of that kind," she said. There was another pause. He set his cup down. "Miss Atwood," he said. "Mr. Ramsey," she said, and now she did look up, and there was something in her face that she was allowing him to see that she did not ordinarily allow people to see, which was the straightforward acknowledgement that she would notice his absence. "When I come back," he said, "I would like to continue this." He gestured between them, at the table and the coffee and the conversation and the sorting table and the lamplight, all of it. She held his gaze with the directness that he had come to understand was her particular form of courage. "Yes," she said, "I would like that too." He smiled again, the full one that changed his face. "All right then," he said. He rode out on a Tuesday morning with the sun not yet fully up, and Ella Atwood was not at the laundry because it was too early, and he told himself this was fine, which it was, and he told himself he was not disappointed, which was less accurate. He was 2 miles outside of town, on the long road that ran southeast toward Wichita through the flat grassland that the morning light turned from gray to gold, when he heard a horse behind him and turned and saw her. She was riding a brown mare that belonged to the stable where she boarded her horse, and she was wearing her everyday dress with a shawl over it against the morning cool, and her hair was pinned up but imperfectly, which told him she had left in something of a hurry. He stopped, and she pulled up alongside him, and they looked at each other in the gold and gray morning. "I forgot to say something," she said. "What did you forget to say?" he asked. She seemed to hold herself very still for a moment, the way she did when she was deciding whether to say an honest thing or a careful thing, and then she said, "I forgot to say that I am glad you heard that conversation through the wall at Harold Midge's office, even though you didn't mean to. And I am glad you told me about the washing soda price, and I am glad you looked at the contract." She paused. "I am glad you came back to the laundry after." He looked at her in the morning light with the prairie stretching out behind her in all directions, the sky enormous overhead the way it only was in Kansas where there was nothing to interrupt it, and he said, "I am glad for all of those things too." She nodded once as if something had been confirmed. Then she said, "Go do your work properly, Vernon Ramsey." It was the first time she had used his given name, and he felt it like something warm against his sternum. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She turned her mare back toward Caldwell, and he watched her go for a moment, and then turned south toward Wichita. And the whole long road he was thinking about a woman who had ridden 2 miles in the early morning to say what she had needed to say, which told him something important about who she was. He wrote to her from Wichita. He had not planned to, but he found himself in his boarding house room on the third evening with paper and ink, and the need to say something that would reach her before he did. And so he wrote about the investigation, which had taken a productive turn. The double branding case had expanded to reveal a network of 2 ranchers working in coordination, and he wrote about Wichita, which was bigger and louder than Caldwell and lacked. He wrote carefully certain qualities that Caldwell possessed. And he thought she would understand what he meant by that without him having to be specific in a letter that would be handled by postal workers. She wrote back. Her letter arrived 6 days later, and he read it in the lobby of the Wichita Livestock Exchange building, sitting in a chair that was too large for the space. And her letter was about the laundry, about a new customer she had acquired, about a disagreement she had witnessed between 2 drovers on Main Street that had been resolved by the intervention of a dog belonging to neither party, and about the weather. At the very end she wrote, in the same precise hand she used for everything, "Caldwell is tolerably interesting on its own, but I find that tolerably interesting is not quite the standard I have begun to hold things to. I am keeping busy." He read that last paragraph 3 times. He came back in 3 weeks, not 4. The investigation was sufficiently advanced to allow it. He rode into Caldwell on a Wednesday afternoon and went to his boarding house and washed the road dust off himself and changed his shirt, and then, with no pretense whatsoever, walked to the laundry on 2nd Street. She was at the sorting table, and she looked up when he came through the door, and something crossed her face very quickly before she controlled it, something bright and unguarded, and then she said in her steady voice, "You're back earlier than expected." "The case moved faster than anticipated," he said. He took his hat off. He was standing just inside the door, and there were approximately 8 feet between them, and it was the longest 8 feet he could recall navigating. She set down the shirt she was holding. "I received your letter," she said. "I received yours," he said. "The dog," she said, turned out to belong to a woman 3 streets over. It came home with a piece of somebody's hat. Whose hat? He asked. The larger of the two drovers, she said, and there was the warmth around her eyes that meant she was suppressing a smile. And Vernon Ramsey crossed the 8 feet between them, and she turned to face him fully, and he said, "I would very much like to take you to supper, Ella." The way he said her name without the formality of the title was an announcement of something, and she heard it as one. "All right," she said. "Give me a moment to close up." He waited outside, and the May evening was warm and the light was long, and when she came out she had repinned her hair and changed her shawl and was carrying her ledger, which made him laugh. "I thought we were going to supper," he said. "I have a notation to make after," she said, without apology, and he laughed again, and she looked at him with that almost smile that was becoming one of his favorite sights in the world. They went to Me's and they ate beef stew and bread and talked for 2 hours, and he told her about the double branding case, and she told him about the new boarding house contract she had negotiated. And when she described the terms, better than her previous contract, precisely specified, with the written notice clause prominently included, he was so pleased for her that he forgot to be restrained about it and said, "That is exactly right. That is exactly the right way to do it." And she smiled at him across the table, a full, real smile, and it was the first time he had seen it without reservation, and he thought he would probably remember the specific quality of it for a very long time. Walking back from Me's in the soft evening, the smell of the stockyards less sharp in the cooling air, the stars beginning to appear over the flat Kansas horizon, Vernon said, "I have been thinking about something." "What something?" Ella said. "I've been thinking about the fact that my work takes me between towns," he said. "I've been doing it for 6 years, and I have managed it because I had no particular attachment to any one place, but I have been thinking that this may have changed." She walked beside him in the quiet before she answered. "What would a particular attachment to a place look like for a man in your work?" she asked. It was the practical question and also the personal one, and she asked it as both. "It would look like a home base," he said. "A town I return to between cases rather than moving from one to the next indefinitely. The association would allow it. I have seniority enough to have some say in my routing." "Would Caldwell be a sensible home base?" she asked. "Professionally?" "It's centrally located on the cattle trade routes," he said. "It would be sensible, yes." "And is the professional sensibility the reason you're considering it?" she asked with the precision that she applied to everything, and he stopped walking and turned to look at her, and she stopped and looked up at him. And in the starlight and the last of the western glow over the prairie she was so clearly, specifically herself, that he felt something in his chest that he had not felt in 5 years, that particular warmth that comes from knowing a person is irreplaceable. "No," he said. "It is not the only reason." She held his gaze. "No," she agreed softly. "I did not think it was." He reached out and she took his hand, which she did simply and without theater, the way she did everything, and they stood like that for a moment on the night street of Caldwell with the cattle town making its evening sounds around them, and then they kept walking, and he did not let go of her hand and she did not ask him to. Summer came to Caldwell with the full force of a Kansas summer, which was not a gentle thing. The cattle drives pushed north, and Main Street filled up with drovers and buyers and the associated industry of a cattle town at peak season. And the laundry on 2nd Street ran at a volume that had Ella working from sunrise until well into the evening, the copper tub steaming and the sorting table perpetually covered. Vernon was in and out of Caldwell on his inspection rounds, gone 3 or 4 days at a stretch, returning with the particular purposefulness of a man who has somewhere he wants to be. He helped her at the laundry sometimes when he was in town, and she had too much to manage alone, which she accepted without excessive protest after he made clear he was offering because he wanted to be useful, not because he thought she needed rescuing. He was competent at it in the way he was competent at most things he put his attention to, methodical and patient, and she found that having him in the space felt natural rather than intrusive, which was a distinction she paid attention to. One July evening, with the heat still thick in the air at 7 o'clock, they were finishing the last of a delivery order and he was helping her fold the finished linens and he said, "There is something I want to ask you." She glanced at him. "Ask it." "I want to ask it properly," he said, setting down the sheet he was folding. He looked at her across the table. "Ella, I have been in love with you since approximately the morning you walked into Harold Midge's office and asked for $11.40 with absolute conviction. I am not certain exactly when it became love as opposed to admiration and interest and the very strong desire to keep talking to you, but I know it has been love for some time." She set down her own sheet and looked at him. "I am 31 years old," he said. "I was married before and I know what it costs to lose someone and I know what it takes to build something with a person. I am not asking lightly. I want to build something with you, Ella. I want to make Caldwell home because you are here, and I want to understand your ledgers and help you read contracts and drink your coffee and argue with you when we disagree, which I think we will, because you are very certain about things and so am I." She was very still. Her face had that quality he had come to know, the one where she was deciding how much of herself to say. "I love you too," she said. "I have been less precise about the timing, but I think it was around the time you laughed at the idea of me carrying my ledger to supper. Because you laughed and then you accepted it completely, and that is," she paused, "that is what it is to be accepted, I think. Completely." He came around the sorting table, and she stepped forward to meet him, and he put his arms around her, and she put hers around him, and they stood in the laundry on 2nd Street in the July heat, and the simplicity of it, the plain, solid realness of two people who had found each other honestly, was so thorough that neither of them felt the need to add anything to it for a good while. He asked her to marry him a month later. He did it in the morning, before she opened the laundry, sitting across from her at her kitchen table with his hat in his hands, and the same directness he brought to everything. And he asked if she would be his wife, knowing that his work involved travel, knowing that he intended to make her his home regardless, knowing that she was already entirely capable without him, and that he was asking not because she needed him, but because he wanted to be needed by her, and to need her in return. Which was the honest shape of marriage as he understood it. Ella sat across from him with her coffee cup and she said, "You have always been honest with me." "I have tried to be," he said. "That matters more to me than most things," she said. "I have been surrounded for 3 years by people who were less than honest, and I have learned to see honesty when it is in front of me." She looked at him. "Yes, Vernon, I will marry you." He let out a breath that was more relief than he had realized he was holding, and she smiled at it, the full smile, and said, "Did you think I would say no?" "I thought you might say you needed more time to think about it," he said. "I have been thinking about it since approximately July," she said, and the humor in her voice was something he had come to treasure specifically, because Ella's humor was dry and precise, and she only let it show when she felt genuinely at ease, and he thought he would spend a great many years making sure she felt genuinely at ease. They were married in September of 1878 at the Caldwell Town Church, a small wood building that held 40 people if they were willing to be friendly about it. Me from the dining room came and cried without embarrassment. The Smith came and did not cry but shook Vernon's hand with both of his own, which was the Smith's version of sentiment. Harold Midge did not come, which Ella had anticipated, and which she found she felt precisely nothing about. The magistrate who had been ready to hear Ella's case against Midge came and told her afterward that he had been looking forward to that case and was mildly disappointed to lose the occasion, which made Ella laugh. They set up together in a house on the edge of town, a proper house with 4 rooms and a kitchen, and a small garden that Ella planted in October with the optimism of a woman who had spent 3 years being purely practical, and had decided that practical could include things that simply grew. Vernon arranged his routing with the Livestock Association so that his circuits kept him within 2 days' ride of Caldwell, and he came home between cases as he had promised he would, and home was exactly what it had become. in the specific way that a place becomes home when a person is there who makes you want to return to it. The double branding case concluded that autumn with both ranchers being charged and fined and losing their brand registrations, which Vernon testified about before a commission in Wichita. He came home from that final hearing in November, and Ella had a meal ready and the fire going, and she poured him a whiskey that he had not asked for but had perhaps needed, and he sat in the chair by the fire and she sat across from him, and he said, "It's done." "Good," she said. Was the testimony straightforward? "Entirely," he said. "The records were clear." He looked at her across the firelight. "I thought of you during the commission, the way you said you'd never asked for more than you were owed." She tilted her head. "Why did you think of that?" "Because the ranchers both said the same kind of thing," he said. "That they were only taking what was reasonable given the market conditions, given the system, the way people who take things frame it as balance." He paused. "And I thought that the people I've met who actually only ask for what they're owed are usually the ones who get given less than that because the ones doing the giving know they'll accept it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You told me once that I had been asking for far too little." "I did say that," he said. "Do you remember what you said back?" "I said that was easy for someone to say from the outside," she said. "That from the inside it looks different. That from the inside you're working with what you have." "I said that was true," he said. "But that working with what you have doesn't have to mean accepting less than you're owed." And then I said, she paused, remembering the conversation, which had happened on a November evening early in their marriage, walking back from a neighbor's supper, the cold just starting in the air. I said I wasn't sure I knew what the right amount was anymore, that I had been calibrating so long to surviving that I had stopped knowing what more than surviving looked like. "Yes," he said. He looked at her, and now she looked back at him. At the house around them, the fire, the garden put to bed outside, the ledger on the table that was in better shape than it had ever been because his knowledge and her diligence had combined into something more effective than either alone. At the man in the chair, honest and specific and present. "Now I know what it looks like," she said simply. He reached across and took her hand, and they sat by the fire in the November evening, and the contentment between them was a solid and unspectacular thing, the kind that does not require expression, because it is simply the fact of how things are. In the spring of 1879, when the new round of cattle drives began pushing north up the Kishom Trail, Ella expanded the laundry. She had the building extended by 12 feet to the south, which gave her room for 2 additional copper tubs and a larger sorting area, and she hired 2 women to help her manage the increased volume, paying them what she thought was a fair wage, which she had carefully calculated against the going rate and adjusted upward slightly, because she believed that fair wages tended to produce more reliable work, and also because it was the right thing to do. The 2 women were Clara Moss, a widow of 32 with competent hands and a sharp eye for detail, and a young woman of 19 named Ruth, who was Clara's niece and who had come to Caldwell from Missouri looking for work, and who turned out to have a gift for organization that Ella immediately recognized and promoted accordingly. Vernon watched the expansion with the pleased attention of a man watching something he had known was possible achieve what it had the capacity to achieve. He helped negotiate the lumber costs for the extension, not because Ella could not do it, but because she was busy managing the laundry through the busiest season, and having 2 people was more effective than 1, and she had learned to accept help without it costing her the sense that the work was hers. That summer Vernon was offered a promotion within the Livestock Association, a senior inspector position that would require him to train newer inspectors and would increase his salary significantly, but would also require more time in Wichita and Abilene, sometimes weeks at a stretch. He came home from the meeting where the offer was made, and he put it to Ella before he answered the association, because it concerned both of them. She listened to the full description of the position, its demands and its benefits, and then she was quiet for a moment and he waited. "It's a good opportunity," she said. "The salary would be a significant addition, and training newer inspectors means more honest inspectors in the field, which matters. It means I would be away more, he said. I know, she said. I can manage the laundry. I know you can manage the laundry, he said. I'm asking what you want, not what you can manage. She looked at him. He did this, asked what she wanted, and it still surprised her sometimes, even nearly a year into marriage, the way he consistently made space for her preferences as distinct from her capabilities. She had spent so long in a world that addressed the latter and ignored the former that his consistent attention to both was one of the things she loved him for most specifically. I want you to take the position, she said. I want you to come home when you can and write when you can't, and I want to know the work you're doing and have you know mine, and I want us to manage the distance without pretending it isn't there. She paused. And I want you to know that I will tell you if it becomes too much. I won't calibrate down to surviving and call it enough, not anymore. He looked at her with something in his face that was too full to name simply. All right, he said, I'll take it. Good, she said. Tell me everything about what the training work involves. I want to understand it. And so he told her, and she asked questions, and the lamp burned low between them on the kitchen table. And it was one of those evenings that does not announce itself as important but becomes, in memory, exactly that. He took the senior position, and it did require more travel, and it was not always easy. There were weeks in the autumn of 1879 where he was in Abilene for 9 days at a stretch, and she was in Caldwell managing a laundry operation that had grown more complex than it had been the previous year, supervising Clara and Ruth, negotiating new contracts, and running the household on her own. She wrote to him regularly, her letters precise and newsy, and occasionally, in the last paragraph, something more personal and unguarded, and he wrote back every time, longer letters than she expected from a man who used words economically in person. She had learned something about him through his letters, which was that the economy of his speech in person was about attention. He waited to say something until he was sure of it, but in writing he was more expansive, more willing to explore an idea while he was still uncertain of where it led, and she found this additional version of him interesting in the same way she found every version of him interesting. By December of 1879, she knew she was expecting their first child. She told him when he came home for Christmas, sitting at the kitchen table in the same way they discussed everything important, which was face to face and directly. He sat very still for a moment when she told him. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I have been tired, but the laundry is managing and Clara has been handling more of the day-to-day." He reached across the table and took her hands. His face had the quality she had learned to recognize as him feeling a great deal more than he could immediately organize into words. "A baby," he said. "In June, I think," she said. He stood up and came around the table, and she stood to meet him, and he held her carefully, his arms wrapping around her with a gentleness that she felt in her chest, and she put her face against his shoulder and let herself simply rest there, which was something she had learned she could do with him, simply rest without managing anything for a moment. "I'll adjust my routing," he said into her hair. "I want to be here more." "I would like that," she said. And she meant it, and saying it cost her nothing, which was how she knew she had stopped asking for too little. He did adjust his routing. He negotiated with the association to concentrate his spring inspections in the areas closest to Caldwell, and to have the Wichita work handled by a colleague through the late spring months, and he was in Caldwell for the majority of May and all of June. Their son was born on the 14th of June, 1880, a Thursday morning, with me from the dining room present because she had delivered half the babies in Caldwell and was more reliable than the doctor, who was frequently occupied with trail injuries. Vernon paced in the front room in a way that me later described as wearing a channel in the floorboards, which was not true but felt accurate. The baby was a boy, healthy and emphatic in his opinions about being in the world, and they named him James, which had been Ella's father's name, and Arthur for Vernon's father, and James Arthur Ramsey arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1880, and immediately became the focal point of his parents' lives in the way that babies do with no apparent effort. Vernon held James for the first time with the kind of terrified reverence of a man who has not held a newborn before, and Ella watched him from the bed where she was resting, and he looked up at her with his son against his chest, and his eyes bright in a way he could not control and would not have tried to. And she thought that this moment, this specific man holding this specific baby in the afternoon light of their specific house, was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Hello, James," Vernon said quietly to the baby. "I have been waiting for you." The baby regarded him with the unfocused intensity of the newly born, which looked like philosophical contemplation. "He has your eyes," Ella said. "He has your expression," Vernon said. "Like he's deciding whether I'm worth his time." She laughed, which hurt a little but was worth it. James grew. He had Ella's dark hair and Vernon's steady way of watching things, and he was a calm baby on the whole, which me attributed to good temperament, and which Ella attributed to the baby having no particular reason to be upset, being as well fed and held as he consistently was. Vernon came home from his inspection routes and found his son different each time, incrementally larger and more capable, and he stayed up late talking with Ella about the changes the way they talked about everything, with attention and specificity and the willingness to simply observe together without needing to have the right answer. The laundry continued to prosper. In 1881, Ella renegotiated all 3 of her major contracts, using language she and Vernon had drafted together based on her original contract and the lessons of the Harold Midge dispute, language so precise about payment terms and service definitions and adjustment procedures that, when she put the papers in front of Harold Midge, who was still secretary of the association, because small-town positions had a certain permanence, he looked at them for a long time and then signed without attempting to negotiate, which was its own kind of satisfaction. Ruth, the younger of her 2 employees, turned out to be not only organizationally gifted but ambitious in the way that Ella recognized because she had it herself, and Ella began teaching her the accounting side of the business, the same way Ella's father had taught Ella from his books. It was a small thing and a large thing simultaneously, the way such transmissions always were. The Kisham Trail's volume began declining in the early 1880s as the Kansas railroad lines extended further south, and cattle no longer needed to be driven the full distance north, and Caldwell's status as a major cattle town began a slow adjustment toward a different kind of commerce. Vernon's work adjusted accordingly, the livestock inspection work shifting to focus more on the rail shipping routes and less on the open drives. In 1882, they built an addition to the house, 2 more rooms to the east side, because the single bedroom that had been James's was no longer sufficient space for a 2-year-old who had developed opinions about where things should be stored, and because Ella was expecting again, due in the late autumn. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1882, with a head of dark hair and an immediate and vocal disposition that made James look at her from across the room, with the considering expression of someone taking the measure of a new situation. They named her Frances after Vernon's mother, and she announced herself to the household with a certainty that Ella recognized. "She knows what she wants," Vernon said on the second night, watching Frances assert her preferences with impressive energy. "Good," Ella said. "I'm going to make sure she always knows." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "I know you will." James was a devoted, if occasionally bewildered, older brother. He brought Frances things she could not yet use, rocks and interesting sticks, and once a very calm lizard, each offered with the solemn generosity of a 2-year-old who has decided that sharing is a practice worth engaging in. By the winter of 1882, Harold Midge had been replaced as association secretary by a man named Cooper who had come from Ohio and who had no particular history with Ella, and who treated her contracts with the matter-of-fact respect that written agreements between business parties deserved, which was both a relief and, Ella privately noted, simply what should have always been the case. She thought about this sometimes, about the 3 years before Vernon, about the calibration she had unconsciously done, adjusting herself down to the size that the world around her seemed willing to accommodate. She had been so focused on surviving, on maintaining the laundry and the land and the contracts, that she had made herself smaller than she was in the belief that smaller things asked for less, and therefore got into less trouble. She told Vernon this on a winter evening, sitting by the fire with James asleep in his room and Frances a warm weight against her shoulder, finally at rest after an opinionated day. She told him that she had understood, over the past 4 years, that what she had called practicality had sometimes been a kind of diminishment, a slow agreement with the world's assessment of what she was worth. Vernon listened, as he always listened, fully and without rushing toward an answer. "You never made yourself smaller with me," he said when she had finished. "No," she agreed. "I didn't. I think because you were looking for the actual size of things, not a comfortable approximation." "I find approximations frustrating," he said. "I spent 6 years on work where everything had to be precisely what it was, the right brand, the right weight, the right certification. Imprecision costs people money and sometimes more than money. I think I carry that into everything." "I know you do," she said. "It is one of the things I depend on." He reached over and tucked a strand of Frances's hair back from her forehead, the baby stirring slightly and then settling, and then he rested his hand over Ella's and they sat in the firelight in their house with their children and the winter outside making no particular demands on them for the moment. "Ella," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should know," he paused, which was unusual for him. "I am aware that I said once in the beginning that you had been asking for far too little. I stand by that, about Midge and the contract and all of it. But I also want to say that you were not wrong to manage things the way you did. You kept the business and the land through 3 years by yourself, and the way you did it was not weakness. It was judgment about what you could sustain." She looked at him. But you could sustain more than you thought," he said. "Not because you found me, but because you always could. He met her eyes. "I wanted to be the thing that made the space for you to find that out." She looked at him for a long moment in the firelight. This man who had heard a conversation through a wall, and told her the price of washing soda and read a contract clause, and come to Wichita in 3 weeks instead of 4, and asked what she wanted as distinct from what she could manage. Who had held her and held their son and paced the floor for their daughter and built 2 rooms onto the east side of the house and come home between roots and written long letters, and never once tried to make her smaller than she was. "You were," she said. "You are." Frances made a small sound of either agreement or complaint. It was difficult to tell at 3 months, and both of them looked at her, and then at each other, and the laugh they shared was quiet and warm and entirely their own. In the spring of 1883, Vernon was offered the position of regional supervisor for the Kansas Livestock Association's Central District, which was a desk position in Caldwell itself, overseeing the inspection teams across the region. He would travel occasionally, short trips, but would be based permanently in town. The salary was substantially better than the senior inspector role. He told Ella about it the evening he received the offer. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and listened to the full description and then said, "What do you think of it?" "I think the desk work will be an adjustment," he said. "I've been in the field a long time." "Do you want it?" she asked, the question precisely phrased. "I want to be home more," he said. "James is 3 years old and I've missed a significant portion of his days. Frances is learning things every week. I want to see it." He paused. "And I want to see you more." She smiled. "Then take it." "The field work was, Vernon," she said. "Yes," he said. "Take the position," she said. "The field inspectors will be better trained with you supervising them directly. The desk work will suit you because you are systematic and fair, and you will be home every evening." She tilted her head. "Those seem like entirely good things." "They do," he said. "They are." He took the position. And she was right about all of it, which she did not say, because saying it would have been rubbing in what was already known, and she was precise rather than unkind. The adjustment to desk work was exactly what he had predicted, a period of restlessness in the first months, the habit of outdoor days hard to replace. And he managed it by taking long rides in the early mornings before the office opened, and by throwing himself into the training aspects of the role with the thoroughness that characterized everything he did, and by coming home to supper every evening and sitting with his family. Which was the thing he had said he wanted, and which turned out to be very good indeed. James, at 3 and then 4, became a small shadow of his father's whenever Vernon was in the house, following him with the dedicated attention of a child who has decided that one particular adult is the most interesting person in his immediate world. Vernon answered all of James's questions, which were numerous and not always answerable, with the same patient honesty he brought to everything else, and Ella watched them from across the room sometimes, her son's face tipped up and intent and her husband's bent toward him, and felt something in her chest that was too large for a single word, and so she did not try to name it. Frances, at 1 and then 2, had the beginning of her mother's particular directness. She pointed at things she wanted rather than crying for them, with the air of someone who has determined that clarity is more efficient than distress. And when she pointed at something and was given the wrong item, she looked at it with a mild contempt that was, Ella had to admit, impressive in a 2-year-old. "She's going to run everything she touches," Clara Moss told Ella at the laundry one morning, watching Frances sit on the sorting table surrounded by folded linens and organize them by some system intelligible only to Frances. "I know," Ella said, without any particular alarm. "I'm going to make sure she has the tools for it." The years moved forward with the productive cadence of a well-organized life. Caldwell evolved as Kansas evolved, the cattle trade giving way to wheat farming as the plains were broken and the homesteaders arrived, and the town adjusted its commerce accordingly, and the laundry on 2nd Street adjusted with it, washing the shirts of farmers as it had once washed the shirts of drovers, reliable and well-run, and paying fair wages and demanding fair payment. In 1885, when James was 5 and Frances was 2.5 and Ella was 33 and Vernon was 38, they had their third child, a boy they named Thomas William, who arrived in July with the cheerful acceptance of someone who has looked at the world and found it sufficiently agreeable, and who from the beginning was the sunniest of their 3 children, delighting James with his babyhood and providing Frances with what she immediately recognized as a subordinate. Vernon held Thomas the same way he had held James, with the terrified reverence, and James stood beside him and looked at the baby with the evaluating consideration of a 5-year-old who has been through this once before and has opinions, and Frances stood on the other side and pointed at Thomas with the index finger that was her preferred instrument of designation, and said, with great clarity, "Mine." Ella, from the bed, said, "Shared." Frances considered this for a moment and then lowered her finger, which was the closest thing to acceptance she reliably offered on short notice. The house was full and loud and warm in the way that a full house is, and Vernon came home every evening to it, and Ella managed the laundry and her household and her children with the same systematic efficiency she had brought to everything since she was 23, except that it was no longer the systematic efficiency of survival. It was the systematic efficiency of a woman who knew what she was building and had chosen it on purpose. Ruth, her younger employee, had grown into a young woman who ran a significant portion of the laundry's daily operations by 1886, and Ella spent more time on the business development and less on the day-to-day physical work, which was a transition she had planned for several years. Clara Moss had become so integral to the operation that Ella had formalized her position with an actual partnership arrangement, giving Clara a percentage of the profits in exchange for her continued management of the workroom, which was both a sound business decision and simply fair, and which Clara had cried about a little and then immediately began being more efficient, which was exactly the response Ella had expected. In the evenings, in the house with Vernon and their 3 children and the lamplight, and the sounds of a Kansas town settling into night, Ella sometimes thought about the woman she had been in the spring of 1878, walking out of Harold Midge's office with $6 in her future, and the careful posture of someone making peace with insufficiency. She thought about that woman without contempt or pity, because that woman had kept the laundry and the land and had built the foundation of everything that came after, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, a great deal. But she was glad, with a thoroughness that went all the way through her, that she had not stayed that woman, that she had let herself be seen clearly enough for someone to see what she was worth, and had let herself look back clearly enough to see what he was. Vernon came in one evening in the autumn of 1886, James now 6 and starting at the town school, Frances 4 and very much managing the household in her own estimation, Thomas a little over 1 and newly mobile in a way that had required the relocation of several things from lower shelves. Vernon came in from the office and Ella was in the kitchen, and he set his hat on the hook by the door and came and stood beside her where she was stirring something on the stove, and he said, "I was thinking about something today." "What something?" She said, which was what she always said. "I was thinking about the contract clause," he said. "The written notice clause in your original agreement with the association." She looked at him. "You were thinking about that today?" "I was reviewing a dispute that came into the office," he said. "A rancher and a buyer, a payment issue, and the resolution was in the written terms of their agreement, and I thought." He paused. "I thought about your face when you read that clause and understood what it meant." "The specific way your face changed," she returned to stirring. "What way was that?" "Like a person finding out they were right about something important," he said. "Not triumphant, just right. The relief of rightness." She was quiet for a moment. "I had been told, effectively, that I was wrong to expect $11, she said. "I had been wrong enough times about enough things in those years that the doubt had gotten into me. Finding out the contract said what I thought it said." She paused. "Yes, that was a particular kind of relief." He stood beside her in the kitchen, the smell of supper and wood smoke, the sound of James's and Frances's voices from the other room where they were conducting some negotiation about the ownership of something, Thomas presumably bearing witness. "I want you to know," Vernon said, "that you were right about everything, not just the contract. About the laundry being worth the work, about the fair wages being worth paying, about Ruth being worth teaching, all of it." She set down the wooden spoon. She turned and looked at him, her husband of 8 years, in the evening light of their kitchen. "I know," she said. "I have always known that, but I appreciate that you say it." "I will keep saying it," he said. "Good," she said, "because I will keep doing the work and it is useful to have someone who notices." He smiled, the full one, and she reached up and touched his jaw briefly, the quick particular intimacy of 2 people who have been together long enough to have a language of small gestures, and then she turned back to the stove. "Tell James and Frances supper is ready," she said, "and check that Thomas hasn't gotten into the cabinet by the window again." "He has," Vernon said, already moving toward the other room. "He's sitting inside it." "He is his father's child," she said, methodically investigating every space available to him. "That is absolutely a compliment," Vernon said from the other room, and she heard James say something and Frances correct him, and Thomas make a sound that meant he was fine and had opinions about being removed from the cabinet. And the kitchen was warm and the food was ready and the evening was ordinary in every way, which is to say it was everything. They had 4 children in the end. The 4th arrived in 1888, another boy they named Samuel, who had Vernon's eyes and Ella's determination, and who came into the world looking, as me, still delivering babies, still reliable, said, like he had a list of things to accomplish. James was 8 by then, old enough to feel the weight of older brotherhood with some seriousness. Frances was 6 and not intimidated by a new baby, having already successfully absorbed Thomas into her domestic framework. Thomas was 3, and regarded the new baby with the interested speculation of someone who has once been the youngest and has theories about what changes when you are no longer. The laundry on 2nd Street had expanded twice more by 1888, and it served the agricultural community as competently as it had once served the cattle trade, and Ella had extended the business model to include a delivery service that Clara supervised and Ruth administered. And the business that had once been a narrow building with copper tubs and one woman managing everything was now a small and solid enterprise with 4 employees, and a partnership arrangement and payment terms that no one could dispute. Vernon's office on Main Street ran the inspection oversight for the Central Kansas District, with a reputation for being the most cleanly run operation in the association, which was the professional reputation he had always aimed for, and had achieved by doing the work the way it needed to be done and expecting the same from the people who worked under him. In the evenings, in all the evenings, they sat together. Sometimes by the fire with the children settled and the house quiet, sometimes at the kitchen table with the account spread between them and both of them working, sometimes on the porch in the summer evenings watching the Kansas sky do its large and remarkable things above the flat land. They talked about everything. They disagreed sometimes, as he had predicted they would, and worked through it with the same directness they had applied to everything since the beginning. They laughed regularly, Ella's dry humor and Vernon's steadier appreciation for it making a comfortable combination. James, at 10, was starting to develop the interested attention to how things worked that his father had always had, and Vernon spent Sunday afternoons teaching him the basics of land survey and account keeping, and Ella watched them at the table and felt the specific pleasure of seeing something transmitted correctly. Frances, at 8, had decided she would read every book in the Caldwell lending library, which had expanded with the town's growing population, and she was proceeding through this project with the systematic determination that should have surprised no one who knew her parents. She and Ella discussed what she was reading at dinner with a seriousness that Samuel, still too young to have opinions about books, was growing up believing was simply how dinners worked. Thomas, at 5, was the child most likely to climb something, which was a parental concern that Vernon addressed by teaching him to do it carefully, and Ella addressed by keeping bandages in the kitchen. On an October evening in 1888, with the children asleep and the first real cold of the autumn beginning to make itself felt in the walls of the house, Ella and Vernon sat by the fire. She had her mending and he had a report he was reviewing, and they had not spoken for 20 minutes, which was not uncomfortable but simply the natural silence of 2 people who had nothing that needed saying at that exact moment. Vernon set down his report and looked at the fire. "Do you remember," he said, "what you said to me the morning I left for Wichita, that first time?" She set down her mending. "I said you had asked for your work to be done properly," she said. She smiled. "And that I was glad you had heard the conversation through the wall." "Yes," he said. He turned and looked at her. "I think about that morning sometimes. You on that horse in the early light coming 2 miles to say something you had not got to say. I had stayed up part of the night deciding whether to," she admitted. "I thought it might be too much." "It was not too much," he said. "I know that now," she said. "I knew it then too by the time I said it, but there was the half of the night before that when I wasn't sure." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I am glad every day that you came down that road." She looked at him. "Vernon, yes. I am glad every day that you heard a conversation through a wall," she said. The fire shifted and settled. Outside, the Kansas autumn wind moved through the dry grass beyond the town's edge, the sound of the plains in a way she had lived with long enough to find comforting, the sound of a vast and open place that held them. She thought, not for the first time, about her father and his belief in fairness and honest work and the things that last. She thought about the ledger and the $11.40 and the clause in the 3rd section of a contract. She thought about the specific word that Harold Midge had used, goodwill, for what was actually theft. She thought about how long she had accepted less than she was owed without quite knowing that she was doing it, calibrating herself to the tolerance of the people around her rather than to the actual value of what she brought. She thought about Vernon asking what she wanted rather than what she could manage. She thought about that distinction, which had taken years to fully understand but which she now held with the same precision she brought to everything important, that capable of enduring something and wanting it were different measurements entirely, and that a person who loved you saw both. She had been owed so much more than $11.40. "Vernon," she said again. "Yes," he said, and he turned from the fire and looked at her, and in the firelight he was the man she had chosen and who had chosen her, specifically and precisely, and the years between spring 1878 and autumn 1888 were laid out between them like a surveyed land, every acre accounted for. "Thank you," she said, "for knowing I had been asking for too little, for saying so." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had on a night street in Caldwell in their beginning, and held it in the comfortable certain way that years together had made natural. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me say it." The fire burned, and the wind moved, and upstairs their 4 children slept in the house that had been built by 2 people who had each, in their own way, been shaped by loss, and then found something more durable than loss to build upon. And the night settled over Caldwell, Kansas, and over the house on the edge of town. And it was good, in the specific and lasting way that things are good when they have been honestly made. In the spring of 1889, James Ramsey was 9 years old and had discovered that he could distinguish between different grades of Kansas wheat by their color at harvest, which his father noted approvingly, and his mother immediately began connecting to trade values. And Francis Ramsey was 7 and had finished the lending library's collection of natural science books and had put in a request for more. And Thomas Ramsey was 4 and had climbed the fence behind the house with increasing competence. And Samuel Ramsey was nearly 1 and was beginning to pull himself to standing with the expression of a person who has decided that crawling is a concession he is no longer willing to make. The laundry on 2nd Street that Ella Atwood had started with borrowed money, and a habit of undercharging had grown into a business that employed 5 people including Ruth, who had become a full partner alongside Clara, and which had a reputation across the central Kansas district for reliable, fairly priced, honestly contracted service. Ella had built it by asking for exactly what she was owed, no more and no less, and by being very clear about both what that number was and where it came from. And Vernon Ramsey came home every evening from his office on Main Street, and every evening the house on the edge of town received him, and every evening Ella looked up from whatever she was doing, mending or accounts or the management of one of 4 children's various pressing concerns, and felt the straightforward gladness of a person who has the right life. Not a perfect life. Not a life without difficulty or shortage or the hard work of managing everything that needs to be managed, but the right one. Specifically and honestly chosen, with the right man and the right work and the right house and 4 children who were growing into their own rightness with the particular confidence of children who have been raised by 2 people who do not diminish themselves. One Sunday afternoon in April of 1889, Ella sat on the porch with her mending and watched Vernon in the yard with James and Francis, teaching them some game involving a rope and posts, Thomas watching from the fence he had successfully climbed, Samuel asleep inside in the afternoon quiet. The sky was the particular Kansas blue of early spring, enormous and clear, the light of it falling on the yard and the people in it with the impartial generosity of a sky that has been large over this land for longer than anyone could account for. She set down her mending and simply watched. Her husband, her children, the yard, the house behind her, the town beyond that, the plains beyond that, the sky above all of it. She had never once asked for more than she was owed. That was still true, exactly as it had always been. She did not ask for more than she had earned, did not take more than was fair, did not claim more than belonged to her. That precision she had kept. But what she was owed, she had finally understood, was this. All of it. The house and the children and the man laughing in the yard with the rope and the posts, and the work that was hers and the partnership with Clara and Ruth, and the evenings by the fire and the letters and the long mornings of Kansas spring, and the particular way Vernon said her name when he had something specific to tell her. That was what she was owed. That was what she had. She picked up her mending and began again, in the good spring afternoon, with everything accounted for and everything as it should be, and the ledger of her life in as honest and precise and thorough a balance as she had ever managed to keep it.